So the continent at this stage does in fact need to undertake some significant structural reforms, I would say transformation, in order to be able to more effectively address these crises, these multiple crises affecting the continent.
Hello everyone, my name is Nandem Bekela. Welcome to another episode of Pathways to Peace. Today I speak with Professor Tim Murithi, the head of Peacebuilding Interventions here at IGR. So today we're going to be discussing how Africa can reduce its reliance on external actors. Professor Tim, hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So the first thing I want us to talk about is what structural shifts are required to reduce the continent's dependency on international actors.
Thank you, Nande, for that question, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast. So across the African continent, we have about 14 conflicts at the moment out of our 55 countries. And that's quite a significant proportion of countries that are going through conflict. A whole range of other countries are also facing political tension. And these situations are generating refugees, internally displaced peoples, humanitarian crisis in terms of food insecurity, so on and so forth. So the continent at this stage does in fact need to undertake some significant structural reforms, I would say transformation, in order to be able to more effectively address these crises, these multiple crises affecting the continent. Our flagship institution is the African Union, which is headquartered in Addis Ababa. And includes all the countries of the continent. And it has a very broad range of policies and treaties that are designed to address peace, governance, and development issues, such as the African Peace and Security Architecture, the African Governance Architecture, the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Development Policy. So we don't have a shortage of policies, really, on the African continent. What we do have a challenge with is in ensuring the effective operationalization and implementation of these policies. This is linked to a number of issues. There is clearly, at the institutional level of the African Union, major challenges in terms of effective and efficient bureaucratic processes. There is clearly a challenge around resource mobilization to fund these initiatives, and also the capacitation of personnel across all countries to ensure that we can more effectively drive our own peace, governance, and development agendas. And I think linked to that is the need for the African continent, the African Union, to in fact transform itself into a much more proactive organization. Regrettably, there is a culture of reaction until the crisis has exploded. Then we find ourselves scrambling to respond to these situations. So an important shift is in fact for the organization to adopt a much more proactive approach to dealing with these issues. On the funding question, in 2016, the African Union committed its members to contributing 0.2% of a tax on imports to what we call the Peace Fund, the African Union Peace Fund. But I would say that the amount generated by this percentile is not sufficient to address the multiple crises that we have on the continent. I mentioned 14 conflicts that we have. So my recommendation is that we should be thinking about increasing this tax to 5% of, say, the defense budgets of countries, to actually ensure that all countries are able to generate sufficient resources for the African Union to address the crises that are evident across our whole region. Which means that governments have to take the African Union more seriously. Governments have to also improve their own internal efficiencies to make them more effective at delivering on the outcomes that we're discussing here on peace, governance, and development.
And you mentioned 14 conflicts around the African continent. What role do they play in peace building efforts?
Yeah, they have a very important role to play, what we call them the regional economic communities. And these are structures that go back to 1981 and what was then called the Abuja Plan of Action, which was to create regional institutions, regional structures that would be able to more directly address conflicts in the proximity of where they are based. This means that, for example, in the Southern African region, we have what is called the Southern African Development Community. In the Eastern African region, we have what is called the Intergovernmental Authority on Development and the East African Community. And in West Africa, we have the East African Economic Commission for West African States, ECOWAS, to name a few. There are a number of others. And what we find within these institutions is the similar challenges that are confronting the African Union in terms of professionalism, efficiency, resource constraints. And the same issue applies to these regional structures. And you would find that most of them, in fact, have their own peace and governance strategies, guidelines, and policies. But it is within these regions that we still find these conflicts erupting. To name but a few, in the Southern African region, obviously, we have a number of situations that are facing difficult conflict and political tension, like in Mozambique, for example.
Yes.
In Zimbabwe, within the Central African region, we've recently been following the crisis between Rwanda and the DRC, in the eastern part of the DRC. In the north, we have Sudan, which has imploded precipitously.
Yes.
And in the Sahel, we still have a crisis of violent extremism afflicting a number of countries. Which, all the regional organizations are doing what they can, but there's much more that can be done, in fact, by improving efficiencies and relying on our own resources as African countries to intervene, again, proactively rather than after the crisis has erupted, which means that we need to strengthen conflict prevention and preventive diplomacy processes at the political level, and that means that we need to also build capacity of actors within these institutions to achieve those outcomes. And I should mention that in the aftermath of these conflicts, a key dimension that needs to be addressed that is often overlooked is the element of transitional justice, which is addressing past grievances, dealing with the past, and establishing processes and institutions and mechanisms that will oversee redress, accountability, and the psychosocial support and healing of communities that have been affected by violence, which is the work that we do here at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation.
Yeah. So you mentioned something about the lack of resources that impact these regional bodies from intervening in spaces like this. So does that mean, when you say lack of resources, you're talking about money, you're talking about people, actors that can educate not only the people involved, but the communities around those areas. So what can be done in terms of that?
Yes, Africa is a continent of 1.4 billion people. So we are a massive continent with, as I mentioned already, 55 countries. If we include the Sahrawi Arab Republic, also known as Western Sahara. And clearly, I don't think there is a shortage of resources on the African continent. I think it's the nature in which political actors, governments, allocate those resources that is a challenge. And not to mention, obviously, the phenomenon of corruption that actually undermines the distribution of resources to key challenges like peace and governance across the continent. So, African governments need to realign their political priorities, reprioritize, what they seek to achieve in terms of peace and governance by allocating sufficient budget to our regional institutions, our continental institutions like the African Union and the regional economic communities to be able to drive these agendas at the continental and the regional level. So it is really a question of how do we as citizens incentivize those political leaders, our governments, to actually take the institutions that they themselves have created and signed up to,
Yes.
and make them work for the people of Africa.
And the youth is very vocal at the moment with the Gen Zs in Kenya and the youth here in South Africa around university crisis, education crisis. So I want to know, like, what do you believe is missing in the current peace building frameworks that fails to fully integrate youth as decision makers, not only as beneficiaries where the government is making the decisions and the youth is basically told this is what's going to happen?
Yes, I agree with your assessment there. The African continent is, I would say, probably the youngest continent in the world right now. We have the largest demographic of young people. And that means that not only the future, but the present right now
Yes.
should belong to the youth. And they should be actively involved in, I would say, even decision-making and policy processes to bring about significant change on the African continent. Unfortunately, what you find is the political processes are still very much controlled and dominated by political elites, often leaders that are geriatric, let me put it bluntly, and I would say also out of touch with the spirit of young people on the African continent. And we've got to find a way to bring people back into the policy, decision-making, and implementation processes of the continent. I say bring them back. I say we've never really had them in it. We need to actually find ways to create spaces that young people can actually engage more proactively in policy making and implementation. And what you've seen across all regions of the continent, youth protests, for example, in South Africa, as you mentioned, protest around university. In fact, the 2015 Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall movement, created certain outcomes. In Kenya, we had the Gen Z protests the last 2 years that have challenged the government's own policies around taxation and have also criticized international institutions that are skewed policies towards Africa, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the WTO. And in Nigeria, you saw the protest of the youth against the police brutality in the hashtag #EndSARS movement. All these movements are indicating that young people are in fact restless, and they want to engage, and they need to engage. And I think it's incumbent upon governments, in particular, more specifically, to actually create spaces where youth actors can engage much more deliberately in peace and governance processes. The African Union has a youth, peace and security agenda, which again is still very much at the level of paper, of ideas and policy frameworks, and still needs to be operationalized much more proactively across the continent in terms of bringing young people into processes of reflecting, deciding, and implementing, policies that will enable the African continent to move forward in a state of peace, security, and improved governance in terms of democratic governance going forward. So that would be my suggestion. I believe the youth are an extremely powerful source of ideas, energy, and determination for the continent. We just need to look at some of the entrepreneurial, developments across the continent to see that the youth have a significant role to play in terms of the future well-being of the African continent going forward.
Thank you, Professor Tim, for coming and joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.